Today, we're very pleased to have Darren James from Specops here to talk to you all on Active Directory password security, identity management, and multi-factor authentication. Darren has over 20 years' experience in the IT industry and is a seasoned cybersecurity professional with a wealth of knowledge and expertise to share. He has worked as a consultant across various sectors and organizations of different sizes, including central and local governments, retail, and energy companies. His areas of specialization include Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and group policy. Darren has been with Specops for over 12 years, and we're very happy to have him here today to share his knowledge with you all. As usual, there will be a Q&A session at the end of Darren's talk, and if any of you want to ask a question, then please feel free to use the chat box to post them up, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Welcome, Darren, and it's great to have you here today, and thanks for taking the time out to speak to our members.
Hi there, Chris. It's great to be here. Thanks for the warm welcome.
Thank you. And if I hand it over to you now, I'll come back in at the end of your presentation.
Fantastic. So there we go. There's my screen. So as Chris was saying, we're going to talk about authentication, passwords, MFA, all of those sorts of things today. Let's dive into it. So first of all, a little bit about who Specops are. So Specops has been solving the password, identity and authentication problems with simple and easy to implement solutions since about 2001. We're now part of the Outpost 24 group, and as a group, we cover a broad range of cybersecurity solutions. So whether that's application security or pen testing or external attack surface management, but essentially what we are trying to do now is bring it all under the umbrella of C10 or continuous threat exposure management. If you're looking for things like that, let us know. We're also ISO and Cyber Essentials certified, and we've got offices and customers all over the world. So let's start off with a quick stats from a relatively recent data breach report. So 2023, so last year, 74% of all breaches involved a human element. And so really we need to help our users stop being the weakest link in our cyber security chain. So whether that's students or staff, it's up to us as the IT guys to help them be a secure part of their network. And how do we currently authenticate our users? Well, after most of the time, it's still Active Directory, right? So after 24 years, Active Directory is still the dominant platform for authentication services across most organizations today. So whether it be in native mode, so you've just got a standalone AD on-prem, or in hybrid mode, so you're synchronizing passwords and users to Office 365, or but it's still regarded as the source of truth when it comes to a user's identity. And so gaining credentials for Active Directory accounts by any means is still a real valuable target for threat actors. And if we cast our minds back to when Active Directory was released back in the year 2000, remember those days of 56K modems and no social media and no cameras on phones, and the thoughts of streaming a 4K video were laughable. I don't think we even had 4K back then. You didn't have to remember a gazillion passwords either, right? So those were happy days. But for the last 24 years, we've had the same password controls in our most commonly used user authentication platform, i.e. Active Directory. And even if we look in Azure or Entra ID, it's still pretty poor in there as well. So unless your name is Mr. Password and password 1234 with a capital P, of course, will still be regarded as a complex password. And changing the number at the end of that password every time it expires is still perfectly acceptable. So that's great, right? No, it's not. It wasn't fine in the year 2000, and it certainly hasn't been fine for many years now. But unfortunately, passwords are still with us. So what's the latest guidance around how we should handle them? So on this slide, I've put newish in the title because this advice has been around now for the last 8 years, believe it or not. So from various regulatory bodies, but it's still only just beginning to be picked up by others. I'm going to use the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre's guidance, as I think it's a great example of what we should do when thinking about modern day user behavior when it comes to choosing good passwords. And it highlights the problems with historical password policies that many of us are still forced to use today. So let's take a little closer look. So what you can see on the screen right now are the bare minimum requirements. In all honesty, they could and should be better. But we do have to remember they have to cater for every type of user, not just in us enlightened security professionals. And this is particularly important in the education sector, as we'll be dealing with a broad range of ages and abilities, especially when it comes to cyber skills. So point one, this relates to essentially the account lockout policy or policies that you have in your Active Directory. You can't do MFA or throttling out the box in AD, but you can set your account lockout thresholds. 10 attempts, I think, is quite generous. We would recommend lower, but there may also be exceptions to that. Minimum and maximum length requirements, well, longer is stronger. Those are wise words, but of no use really with a standard AD toolset due to the lack of granularity when it comes to complexity. And point three talks about removing complexity. But if you do this in a standard policy, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0 will be a perfectly acceptable password. And obviously we know that's just the string of characters along the top of your computer. It's not. And I'm talking of complexity, the recommendation is that you should remove it. So passphrases made up of multiple words should be used instead with no complexity requirements. So great idea, but again, no way to enforce this with standard AD password policies. And there is also a recommendation around removing expiry. And again, you need to be a little bit careful when you're considering something like that. There will be exceptions and other considerations you need to take into your thoughts. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, point four, how do you know if your users are already using breached passwords? And if these now non-expiring passwords become breached, how will you find out and what can you do about it? And of course, how much effort, time and money is involved in doing all of this manually? So, these are really good points, but how do we achieve them? Well, first of all, how do you know if you've got a problem in the first place? And we've got a great free tool for you, and that's called Specops Password Auditor. I've already had a few chats with I think some of you on the EduGeek forums about this, but it is a brilliant tool. That's right, it is completely free to use. It uses a database that we regularly update. In fact, just last week we released version 33 of the database and added a further 17 million password hashes to that database. Bring it to just over 1 billion password hashes. And that's the small version of our database, believe it or not, but it's up to date with all the latest public release breaches and stuff that's hit our honeypot system. So pretty relevant. It can give you a really good insight into where you've got problems with password hygiene and if you're meeting any compliance standards in seconds. So it's not cracking anybody's password, which I think is really important. So you're not going to leave sensitive data lying around on your computers or even in memory on the machine that you're running at. It's purely comparing hashes. So it looks at your user's current password hashes, compares them with the 1 billion hashes in the database, and then tells you if they're breached. And finally, it doesn't phone home to us. So as hopefully you're all paranoid cybersecurity people like me, you don't need to worry about us finding out your results before you do. So as long as you have the installer and as long as you have a copy of the database, it'll run just fine on an air-gapped restored from backup domain controller. So restore one of your DCs, air-gap it, put our tools on there, run it, and yeah, you don't have any fears about it coming back to us. So what can we do to solve the AD problem, password problem once and for all? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that now. Password Auditor tells us where we've got the problem, but how do we fix it? So as I've already mentioned, the existing tool set in Active Directory, which is effectively just complexity on and off and how long your password's going to be, is extremely limited in options and no longer really fit for purpose. There are third-party tools that can achieve higher standards, and at the same time help your end users change their behavior. However, there is no option from Microsoft. Even if you look at the offerings from Entra ID, they're still really woefully poor. So let's take a look at each of these points in a little bit further detail. So throttling is always going to be difficult to achieve, but we can certainly improve on the 10 attempts before lockouts. Don't forget that not all of your users are the same. Every organization typically has 3 different types of user, and they are regular users, admins, and service accounts. And of course, within the education sector, you're likely to have different keyboard and security awareness amongst your users, or keyboard skills, I would say. So from anything from your younger students all the way up to your administrative staff. And really the idea here is to apply the right policy to the right users. And it's particularly important when it comes to the account lockout rules, as your current settings could be used against you. For example, of the denial of service attack on your critical services via your service accounts. And of course, admins should also have a much stricter policy than users. Threat actors are not just external threats. They could even be some of the more IT savvy kids at the school. They don't just target one user in your environment, they will target them all. They'll figure out your account lockout threshold, let's say it's 10 attempts and resets every 30 minutes. So they'll send 9 passwords against every account every 30 minutes until they find one that works. And this typically won't trigger any alerts on your side. And so once they have a working user and password combination, they can then work on socially engineering the service desk or IT admins, or tricking staff into accepting or handing over an MFA token. And also remember, MFA, if you have it implemented at all, comes in many forms, and none of them are infallible. So let's talk about MFA a little bit more as well. So not all MFA is equal, but they can basically be boiled down into 3 different types. So something you know, something you have, something you are, and then 2 signals. So these are things that kind of work alongside something you have, something you know, and something you are, and that is somewhere you are and something you do. So let's go back to our 3 definitions. So something you know, you need to look at the clock behind me to know that I'm a huge Star Wars fan. So I think you can have a pretty good guess at what my favorite film is. Something you have, typically a mobile phone. One-time codes can be intercepted, particularly over SMS or email. So make sure that there are controls in place if you're using these. And then third-party options like FIDO2 tokens, mobile like YubiKeys, for instance. Mobile authenticators such as Google, Microsoft, and Authy are better, but then they rely on the physical security of those devices. And then something you are, biometrics, Face ID, Touch ID, Google Fingerprint. Great if they work all the time, but we've seen varying results with fingerprint and face scanners, so you can't always rely on them. And finally, there are the signals which can complement the MFA factors. So somewhere you are, for example, are you in the office or are you at home? If you are at home in the UK, or if you're trying to authenticate from, let's say, Russia or North Korea, does that look legitimate or not? And something you do. So this is essentially user behavior, such as logging in at certain times of day. So MFA is important. And although it may not be practical, especially for students, but it is only one part of the authentication story and isn't a silver bullet. So your chosen MFA solution might not meet all of your use cases, and some are more designed for user convenience rather than security. So we need to still consider our passwords, which are usually the recovery option when MFA fails, and therefore still a potential backdoor into your network. So modern day guidance with regards to length is 8 or 12 characters with no complexity rules applied. And if we look at this chart, it doesn't really stack up well when it comes to time to crack. Within the education sector, it's certainly about applying the right policy to the right user again. So I know some schools that have used password policy as a teaching aid for students, essentially getting the students to set stronger passwords as they move through the years at school. So by the time they finish school, they're all using great passphrases. And I think that's a really nice way of using this technology. The NCSC has also been pushing passphrases for the last 8 years. And their basic premise is think of 3 random words. So 3 words that mean something to you, but nothing to anybody else. We would recommend this route, but we would maybe go a little bit further. So let's say think of 3 memorable words with at least 6 characters in each word, and then maybe put a special character between each of those words. So 3 times 6 is 18, plus another 2 special characters between the 3 words. Yeah, we're suddenly up to 20 characters in length. Maybe even deliberately misspell one of those words. So that gives you 20 plus characters. If it's all lowercase, yeah, great. That's still nearly 1 billion years to brute force an MD5 hash. And even with GPUs and CPUs getting quicker all the time, that should still buy all of us a little bit more time, especially right now. There's nothing to stop users from putting 2 short words together either, but essentially we want them to choose something that's easy to type, easy to remember, but extremely hard to crack, and maybe especially in schools, difficult to shoulder surf as well. So, you know, a student looking over a teacher's shoulder, for instance. However, may the force be with you, another Star Wars reference there, is a 20-character long passphrase or phrase, but not one I would recommend. 1, because it's a well-known sentence, and 2, because it's already been breached. And this is another problem. If these passwords or passphrases exist on if the hash of those passwords or passphrases exists on a rainbow table already, they can be instantly cracked. So it doesn't matter about the length if it's already been breached. But how do you know if our users are already using breached passwords and phrases like this? And even if they aren't, what can we do if they are breached in the future? So what if they set an amazing passphrase today and then reuse it on something else? That something else gets attacked and breached and their password stolen, and then it ends up on out in the open. Well, we could try cracking them ourselves, but that's ethically questionable and potentially could leave clear text passwords on your network somewhere. So we'd need to be a little bit careful if you're cracking our own passwords. You could run Specops Password Auditor, that free tool that I spoke about earlier, but that's only going to give you a report and not actually fix the problem. But really, to meet these requirements, you need to look for a solution that can continuously scan your AD users' passwords against a frequently updated database, against all of the known breach passwords. And only then really can you consider adopting the recommendation of only expiring passwords if they become breached. So if you want to go down that road of never expiring passwords, you do still need to have something in place that will make sure your users' passwords and passphrases haven't ended up in a publicly leaked database somewhere. We also have to understand that this isn't the user's fault. They have many passwords to remember these days. So it's whether it's students or staff, work or personal lives, we've all got lots and lots of passwords to remember. And so we, as the IT professionals, and in some cases teachers, have a responsibility to help them manage this password problem and educate them on better password hygiene. So we need to find a way to wean people off the brainwashing they've had for the past 24 years. That password 1234 with a capital P is a great password. So how do we do that? Well, we can do all of the things we talked about before, implement passphrases, expire on breach, all of those sorts of things. But basically, it is still down to that same premise that we need to apply the right policy, again, to the right users. Admins, users, service accounts will all need different rules. And again, students compared to teachers will probably need different rules. And then don't forget about things like cyber insurance or regulatory requirements. So if you've got people in the finance team who may be taking credit card payments, they might be affected by PCI. So again, you might need a PCI policy just for those particular members of staff. We should try and adopt that 3 random word approach where applicable, remove complexity and go for that longer passwords instead. That's a bit of a no-brainer really. Removing expiry, yes, from certain users, and maybe reward users that adopt passphrases with no expiry or expire only if breached. We should block easily guessable words that relate to your organisation, so school name or department or the services they provide, even maybe the location names of where you might have campuses. And then we need to make sure that the solution that we do employ has the capability to continuously scan all of your existing AD passwords and expire them on breach. And really, that's a vital part of the story. And finally, we should always make sure that the users get great feedback. So you can see on the screen at the moment, there's an example of the feedback that our client provides. And that is initially when they set their first password, when they need to change their password, and when they sometimes forget their password. And make sure you implement, if you are going, if you've got a large school or a large staff population, make sure you look at implementing a self-service password reset solution that supports any existing MFA that you have, which can be used on any device and from any location to lessen the burden on the IT team or the service desk and increase the uptime for your users. Because our kids don't have too many years or hours at school, do they, these days? So we want to make sure they're productive. And thinking about the first password that you set for new starters, whether they be students or staff, the other problem that a lot of schools face is how do you get the first password to your user, especially nowadays, since, and this is maybe more to do with university students rather than secondary school or primary school, but how do you get a password to those remote users, to your foreign students, for instance? Many organisations in the education sector set the same password for new staff or students, or resort to emailing or SMSing the user their credentials. But you're essentially sending out a password in plain text via a third-party system that can be easily compromised. In fact, when we did a study of breached passwords earlier this year, the most commonly used 15+ character password contained the words like welcome and new hire. So that really emphasized this issue to us. So sending any password in plain text to anyone is generally a bad idea, especially if it's over an insecure channel such as email or SMS. But if it's delivered securely, just having it on screen, written down somewhere, still poses a risk, especially as they may not have enrolled for any of your MFA solutions yet. So we'd suggest not sending the password in at all. Instead, let the user securely verify themselves by using some identity factors such as their personal mobile number or personal email address or both, which they can then use to prove themselves to a self-service system that lets them set their first password. And this can be done from their phone or their home computer or even the login screen from their newly received laptop, which will also update the locally cached credential on that machine, even without a VPN, set the password in AD, and also sync the password to their Entra ID account if required. So there's no need to weaken security. You can still force users to change password next logon, and that new starter security gap is effectively closed. So in summary, it only takes one weak password to bring your entire network down. The 21st century password policy rules aren't achievable with the built-in toolset. One size does not fit all. So make sure you apply the right policy to the right staff and students. Implement MFA if possible, but don't rely on that second factor or third factor sometimes, and forget about your passwords. They are still a critical part of your authentication puzzle, and make sure you use reliable phishing-resistant MFA services. And finally, help your users. Provide awareness training to staff, provide helpful feedback whenever they need to set a password, and alert them when, not if, their password becomes compromised. So I hope that's been a useful presentation, and I'd like to open the floor to questions. I can see there's a few comments that have come through. So are you back with us, Chris?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Darren. That was very informative. I think we've got one or two questions. If Sean can post the first one up, we'll get that read out. Okay, yeah. So what risks are there with self-service password resets? We have been hesitant to do this until we can check on the risks.
That's a really good point. I mean, if we think about some of the older fashioned password reset solutions out there, they do rely on really terrible ways of identifying people, like what is your favorite film? And especially these days of social media, it's pretty easy to find out what my favorite film is, what my favorite pop group is, what my favorite author is, what my mother's maiden name was, what my favorite pet's name is. We've all seen these quizzes, right, on Facebook and Instagram. You know, what's your film star name, or whatever it might be. So yes, if you're using a self-service system that relies on a weak identity factor, such as a secret question, the answer is, yeah, that's not a good way of doing it, especially if it's exposed publicly. However, there are other self-service systems that can rely or even score certain ID services. So let's say you're using a phone with a biometric on it, like an iPhone or an Android, whatever it might be. That's a pretty good way of identifying someone, right? Because it's something they have, their phone, something they know, the PIN code to unlock their phone, and then something they are. That's a pretty good way of making sure that it is actually Darren or Chris at the other end of the line. Certainly much better than what's your favorite film. So look for better ID services if you're going down the self-service route. And then obviously look for who owns the data. You know, is it in the US? Is it in the EU? Is it hosted by, is the user data hosted by you? All the usual things that hopefully you should be able to, or you should go through when looking at any new vendor. But yeah, good question. Hope that helps.
Okay, and we've got another one here. What are the requirements for the auditor? They don't want to overload the DC.
Well, you don't need to run it on the DC at all. So that suggestion of running it on an air-gapped DC is just there for, you know, super paranoid people like me. But if you're happy to run it in a live environment, or you want to restore a Windows 11 or Windows 10 workstation that's domain joined, you can run it on that, as long as it's got enough space for the database. So that's 6.5 gigabytes of space. I'd probably recommend, 8 gig of RAM on that workstation or server that you're running it on. I think most people have got at least 8 gig of RAM these days. You're absolutely fine. And then it literally is run it, click next, tell it where the database is, click finish, and it's done. As I say, it's not cracking anybody's passwords, doesn't leave any files, any nasty files anywhere with any sensitive data. You can even run it with run it and anonymize the results as well if you're super paranoid. But it is completely free, and I do recommend that you run it, even if it's to tell you you've got no problems at all. It's worth downloading and running.
Brilliant, and I think that's it for questions. Okay,
Brilliant.
I'd like to thank Darren and Specops for joining us today, and you all for attending.